The night of December 15th into December 16th, 2020, in the small French town of Cagnac-les-Mines, passed quietly for most of its inhabitants. Yet around 11 p.m., two neighbors were startled by a sharp, brief scream from a woman, a sound that broke the usual stillness in this residential area. Both witnesses described it as an abrupt interruption, the cry cut off mid-sentence. Pay attention to this moment. That scream would become the only audible trace of that night. At the same time, in the Jubelhar home, their 6-year-old son later told investigators that his parents had been arguing loudly. Although he was unable to recall exactly what the dispute was about, the fact that a quarrel did occur confirmed the neighbors' observations. The boy didn't give it much importance at the time, since conflicts in the family had happened before. But this instance would mark the beginning of the entire investigation. The behavior of Cedric Jubilar on that night would later raise questions. He did not appear distressed and, according to investigators, acted far too calmly. It is impossible to reconstruct his emotions in full detail, but what was recorded in the case file is the absence of any sign of panic. Then, in the silence of a December night, no one realized that in those minutes, an event was unfolding that would determine years of investigations, searches, and disputes. This was the night everything was decided, yet no one around understood the scale of what was about to unfold. Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's story, I just want to ask you to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and drop a comment down below. I put a lot of effort into bringing you real, true crime cases from all around the world, only authentic stories here. Your support really helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate any interaction. After that December night, the investigation's attention immediately shifted to the woman whose screams had been heard. Delphine Jubilhar was born in Gaillac in 1987. She worked nights as a nurse and balanced that schedule with caring for 2 children. The family lived in the small town of Cagnac-les-Mines, where life seemed predictable and quiet. Home, job, children. This routine gave the impression of stability. It's important to note here, her profile in the documents fully matched the descriptions given by those close to her. Delphine was independent, calm, and organized enough to handle the demanding schedule. But by 2020, she had decided to divorce her husband. The reasons were not officially disclosed, but her attorneys emphasized that the couple planned to end the relationship amicably. Yet, tensions at home remained. Differing views about the future and everyday conflicts were gradually accumulating. The contrast between the familiar image of Delphine and what happened next became one of the first questions for investigators. The woman described as responsible and devoted to her children suddenly disappeared. And it was precisely this discrepancy that became the starting point for analyzing the subsequent events. The morning of December the 16th marked the moment when Delphine's story first caught the attention of the police. Just after 7 a.m., Cedric Jubilar called the emergency service and reported that his wife had been missing for several hours. He stated that he last saw her late the previous evening, but only noticed her absence during the deep night. He could not specify a precise time, offering instead the range between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. According to Cedric, before contacting the authorities, he made several attempts to reach out to Delphine. He even messaged one of her close friends, assuming Delphine might have gone to stay with her. That friend was the one who received a message from him asking her to let Delphine know she should come back home. The response was immediate and clear. Delphine wasn't there. Despite his repeated attempts to get through, Cedric didn't reach out to law enforcement until after sunrise. He later explained that he'd wanted to wait until morning, hoping she'd return on her own. But for investigators, that delay raised some red flags. When someone suddenly vanishes, timing is everything. And waiting several hours before reporting it is, at the very least, unusual. I have to say, that wide gap in his timeline feels off. It definitely raises some serious questions. Police arrived promptly. Their sweep of the house and backyard turned up no signs that Delphine had left during the night. Her car was still in the garage, her belongings were untouched, and both kids were asleep. Officers noted that nothing in the home suggested she'd been planning to leave, especially not in the middle of the night, and certainly not without saying anything. These early findings cast doubt on Cedric's version of events. And so, the investigation began. What started as a simple missing person case quickly began to expand, with Cedric's early morning call becoming the starting point for everything that followed. Search operations kicked off almost immediately after his call. Authorities deployed K9 units, thermal imaging gear, drones, and ground teams to sweep the surrounding areas of Cagnac-les-Mines. Locals rallied quickly, forming search parties and volunteering their time. Within just a few days, close to 1,000 people were combing through rugged terrain, steep slopes, narrow trails, areas that required extreme caution and a detailed search. And here's the critical question. Could Delphine have navigated this kind of terrain at night, with no lighting, completely on her own? In one of these difficult-to-access spots, investigators found her personal items: a phone, pieces of clothing, and a knife. The area had no artificial light, and the objects were scattered as if someone had thrown them, not dropped them while walking. What's more, there were no signs indicating she had made her way there on her own. Police noted that even with a flashlight, the route would have been nearly impossible to navigate safely in the dark. Forensics experts examined her phone data. The final signal came in on the morning of December 16th, just over a mile from her home. The device transmitted coordinates and then suddenly shut down, not from a dead battery, but from what looked like a sudden, intentional interruption. That abrupt break in the signal became a major piece in this unfolding puzzle. Taken together, the scattered belongings, the lack of any trackable route, and the strange phone behavior all painted a picture that didn't look anything like a voluntary disappearance. The layout of the scene and the tech data started pointing toward possible outside interference. A shift that completely changed the direction of the case. Investigators also took a close look at the flashlight. There was no evidence it had been used. Not when she supposedly left the house, and not later on. The area where her items were found had no lighting whatsoever, and navigating it in the dark without some form of illumination would have been nearly impossible. This became yet another argument against the theory that she'd left on her own, because the path simply didn't match the behavior of someone who was trying to get away independently. A month later, in January and February of 2021, Delphine's phone showed some unusual activity. Certain functions seemed to activate automatically, brief signals but without any attempts to connect to a network. This triggered concern among investigators, who started to consider whether someone might have accessed the phone remotely or tampered with it. To figure out what was going on, investigators reached out to tech specialists at Samsung. The company responded that such activity could happen as a result of diagnostic operations. According to them, deep-level device checks can trigger automated processes, which cellular providers might register as the phone powering on. Still, even with that explanation, the investigation kept all possibilities open. A software glitch, remote access, or even side effects from forensic analysis. No theory was confirmed or dismissed until more data became available. While the phone didn't lead to Delphine's location, it did help establish a timeline and hinted at the possibility that someone may have interfered with it the night she vanished. Alongside the tech investigation, detectives turned their focus to Delphine's personal life. Of particular interest was her communication and photos with a man she'd been seeing. They had been making future plans together, and on the evening before she disappeared, she sent him a personal photo. His alibi was verified right away. He had been at home, and that was confirmed by third-party sources. Then there was his wife, Kate, who also came under scrutiny. Just a day before Delphine disappeared, Kate had made several calls to the number associated with her husband's private messages. She had also reached out to Delphine, claiming they'd agreed to pause the relationship until after the divorce was finalized. But that agreement appeared to have been broken that very night. Though this created a tense dynamic, there was nothing concrete tying the situation to Delphine's disappearance. It seemed more like a personal conflict than anything criminal. Another man also surfaced in the investigation, someone previously involved in a car incident with the Jubilhar family. Despite their past tensions, his involvement was ruled out quickly, with a solid alibi backed by external data. Neighbors mentioned a van that had been parked near Delphine's house for several days. Investigators tracked down the owner and conducted an interview. After comparing times and travel routes, no link to the case was established. Nearly every lead had to be investigated thoroughly. One after another, they were dismissed. Lack of motive, airtight alibis, and inconsistent timelines. By the end of this phase, it became clear that none of the peripheral individuals offered a clear direction for the investigation. As the official case started losing momentum, online communities began to take over. Large groups emerged across social media platforms, especially on Facebook, where one group alone reached nearly 8,000 members. Every day, people posted theories, analyzed media, debated witness statements, and discussed search efforts. Users tried piecing together the puzzle, but without access to the actual case files, most of it turned into noise rather than helpful insight. If we're being honest, while these groups kept public attention alive, they did more to stir confusion than support the actual investigation. Some of the posts that started circulating online were based on speculation, distorted facts, or flat-out wrong conclusions. That wave of misinformation often got in the way of real police work. Officers had to waste valuable time verifying false discoveries, while emotionally charged debates built unrealistic expectations among the public. Delphine's family attorneys stressed that this kind of disinformation could potentially compromise the integrity of the investigation and create unwarranted pressure based on public opinion. Her relatives also pointed out that some of the online activity crossed serious boundaries. People who had no connection to the case were being publicly accused by internet users with no evidence. Eventually, the social media chatter became a separate issue, one that police had to consider carefully to avoid distractions and misdirection. Once all the external theories had been ruled out one by one, the investigation turned its focus squarely on Cedric's behavior the night his wife vanished. The first thing that didn't sit right was his own account of what he did after realizing Delphine was gone. Cell phone tracking data showed he only walked about 40 steps before police arrived. But during a later walkthrough with investigators, he retraced nearly 400 steps. That kind of discrepancy was too large to ignore. He claimed he didn't want to make noise at night, but that level of restraint seemed strange to investigators. Honestly, I find that part hard to reconcile. If your spouse goes missing, is that really the time to worry about being quiet? Then there was the car. Delphine's vehicle was parked differently than usual. It wasn't how she typically left it. Inside, police found fresh condensation on the windows, a sign that someone had recently been in the car. One theory suggested that it had been used that night and then returned, but that clashed with Cedric's statement that his wife had left on foot. Another odd moment came from what he told police just minutes after waking up. He said something had happened to his wife, wording that investigators found too conclusive, too fast. Typically, in these situations, people first assume a misunderstanding, a fight, or maybe a walk to cool off. But jumping straight to the idea that something serious had occurred raised eyebrows. As the interviews continued, inconsistencies started stacking up. The times he mentioned didn't align with digital timestamps. Some parts of his story shifted from one statement to the next. His explanation for the timing of his calls and multiple efforts to reach Delphine were incomplete. Phone records showed that he made 180 attempts to contact her, but all of those happened before he called for help and before he checked the house thoroughly. This pattern, behavioral oddities, shifting details, and tech data not matching the story, gradually pushed Cedric to the center of the investigation. Detectives still needed stronger proof, but even by this point, it was becoming clear. His actions that night were a critical piece of the puzzle. By the summer of 2021, investigators had exhausted all external leads, and their focus had fully shifted to the husband. On June 16th, Cedric was taken into custody and officially named as a suspect in the crime involving Delphine and the concealment of her remains. The arrest was sudden. That morning, officers arrived at the home, conducted a search with official witnesses present, and brought him in. It's important to note here, the decision to arrest wasn't based on one piece of evidence, but rather on the accumulation of many. Around the same time Cedric was taken into custody, his new girlfriend was also brought in for questioning. Authorities wanted to determine whether she might have had any knowledge of what happened that night, or whether she knew anything about the possible relocation of Delphine's remains. After several days of interrogation, she was released. No direct connection to the disappearance was found, and the details she provided did not conflict with established facts. The prosecution confirmed that the case against Cedric wasn't built on one single moment. It was a combination of multiple elements. These included discrepancies in his behavior on the night of the disappearance, contradictions in his statements, and technical data that didn't support his version of events. Investigators pointed specifically to unusual changes in the car's position, activity on Delphine's phone, and the sequence of events reconstructed from digital traces, all of which factored into the decision to arrest him. Cedric maintained his innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with Delphine's disappearance. But investigators believed he was the last person to see her alive, and that his story didn't add up. At the time of his detention, the formal charge was described as intentional harm resulting in the loss of a spouse, without recovery of the remains, which required significant evidence. Prosecutors emphasized that they weren't basing their case on speculation, but rather on a serious and cohesive set of facts that, in their view, pointed directly to Cedric. Following the arrest, investigators began a thorough review of Cedric's background to better understand how his life experiences may have shaped his response in a high-stress situation. He had grown up without consistent support, orphaned at a young age, bounced between foster families, and carried with him a deep sense of abandonment. Those close to him recalled that he often tried to appear independent, but beneath the surface, he showed emotional immaturity and a strong need for outside validation. People who knew him described him in conflicting ways. Some saw him as hardworking, while others viewed him as manipulative and unable to handle pressure. Within the Jubilhar household, there were unspoken imbalances. Delphine had stable employment and a promising future, whereas Cedric faced inconsistent job opportunities. Experts who evaluated his personality noted that while he didn't display patterns of aggressive behavior, he did show high levels of frustration, often triggered by feelings of failure or dependency on his wife. Psychologists emphasized that his responses weren't typically violent. They stemmed more from fear of losing the support system he believed was crucial to his identity. And in my opinion, this internal conflict, this mix of fear, pressure, and emotional instability, played a central role in how investigators interpreted his actions that night. With the case entering a more intense phase, police ramped up their efforts. After completing initial forensic analyses, tactical teams resumed active field searches. They combed through caves, abandoned tunnels, and steep ravines, the kind of places that require special equipment just to access. The areas surrounding Cagnac were swept again, this time with thermal imaging tools and the support of mountaineering teams. Investigators were leaving nothing to chance. The scale of the search reflected just how troubling it was that, even in those crucial early hours, there had been no trace of Delphina, no signs of a voluntary departure, and no clues that she had been moved. That silence spoke volumes, and for investigators, it was a warning sign. One specific site drew significant attention: a burned-out farm. The reason? A cellmate of Cedric had allegedly heard him make a confession while behind bars. Investigators launched a full-scale search of the location, using ground-penetrating radar, excavation tools, and combing through every pit and layer of soil. But the results came up empty. No remains, no forensic traces, nothing to indicate that this spot had ever been used by someone involved in a crime. These inconsistencies only highlighted how shaky jailhouse testimony can be. And honestly, prison confessions like this often send investigations chasing the wrong leads. Police also dug into any potential enemies of the family. They looked into past disputes, household tensions, work-related conflicts, and even long-standing grudges. But none of those lines of inquiry produced motive or reliable timeframes. Everyone involved had verified alibis, and no one could be tied to the timeline of that December night. By December 2022, investigators attempted a full reconstruction of the night's events. They retraced the movements of every key individual, cross-checked phone data, analyzed vehicle routes, and re-examined all timing details. This process gave them a clearer overall timeline, but the central question remained unanswered. Where was Delphina after 11 p.m.? Despite the granular analysis, no alternate theory could explain the disappearance, and the search zone continued to yield no solid leads. The investigation then turned toward vehicles connected to people in Cedric's inner circle. First on the list was a car owned by one of his friends. Inside, investigators found trace amounts of blood and several strands of hair. That triggered a deeper forensic review. But after testing, experts confirmed the biological material belonged to the car owner and his family members. The minor traces were attributed to everyday use, and there was no connection to Delphina's case. That turned into a dead end. Still, investigators followed another potential thread. A white vehicle that the same cellmate had claimed Cedric mentioned specifically. According to him, Cedric described a make and model supposedly used to transport the body. Police reviewed every matching vehicle in the area. Not one had crossed paths with the potential crime scene. No suspicious routes were identified, and all owners had solid alibis. This cast serious doubt on the accuracy of the jailhouse account. Meanwhile, DNA testing was running into significant limitations. Without a body, there was no control sample from Delphina. That meant any biological material found couldn't be reliably matched. While lab equipment could detect traces, it was technically impossible to confirm whether they had any connection to the case or were simply background contaminants. And it's important to point out, without a definitive reference point, these tests rarely yield anything conclusive. Investigators also conducted a full forensic sweep of the Peugeot Delphina used. The inspection covered the trunk, cabin, floor mats, and interior compartments. No signs of a struggle, movement of heavy objects, or attempts to clean up biological material were found. Data logs from the car showed no nighttime activity and no significant change in mileage, further lowering the likelihood that it played any role in her disappearance. All these pieces, the blood, the hair, the vehicle logs, and the cellmate's statements, formed a chain of circumstantial evidence. They demanded thorough investigation, but none of them led to a clear, verifiable breakthrough. and that left the prosecution's case still standing on an accumulation of indirect signs rather than concrete forensic proof. After Cedric's arrest, his legal team built a defense strategy around the absence of direct evidence. They filed 7 separate motions requesting his release, arguing that keeping him in custody for such an extended period was no longer justified at this stage of the investigation. But each time, the court denied the request, stating there were no sufficient grounds to alter the conditions of his detention. His attorneys also argued that the conditions of his confinement were infringing on his rights. According to them, the isolation, restricted communication, and ongoing status as a suspect were placing undue pressure on him. These claims became part of a broader public campaign, portraying Cedric as someone being held without solid justification. Prosecutors, on the other hand, strongly opposed his release. They pointed to contradictions in his own statements, the potential risk of him influencing witnesses, and concerns that he might conceal information that was still under review. And I think it's important to recognize, in complex cases like this, judicial decisions are based not just on hard evidence, but also on an assessment of potential risks. That logic helps explain why the court repeatedly rejected the motions for release. Legal arguments dragged on for months. Both sides continued reinforcing their positions, but the outcome remained unchanged. Cedric stayed in custody while investigators pushed forward with the case. In 2023, volunteers launched another round of searches, this time targeting areas that had previously been inaccessible due to steep terrain. Unfortunately, that effort came up empty as well, deepening the sense that this case had reached a frustrating standstill. And I have to say, it's hard to understand how such intensive efforts didn't uncover even the faintest trace. As the investigation settled into a stable but stagnant phase, detectives made their position clear. It was the pattern of circumstantial evidence, inconsistencies, and Cedric's behavior after Delphine disappeared that pointed toward his involvement. But with no body ever found, investigators couldn't conduct key forensic analyses that might have confirmed, or ruled out, the crime theory. Cedric has consistently denied any wrongdoing, and the lack of a confession has left the case suspended in uncertainty. Neither the investigation nor Delphine's loved ones have been able to fully understand what happened. In closing, it's fair to say the prospects for a trial remain uncertain. The case is built on logical inferences rather than concrete physical evidence, which makes the prosecution's position particularly fragile if any aspect of the narrative begins to shift.